Alright, so today I've got a pretty interesting video. I'm going to be showing you how I go about annotating my books. You can see I have a certain way of doing it, and it changes from book to book is the interesting part. I've got all sorts of different writing utensils that I use and methods of marking, and I'm going to be talking about each of those from the perspective of a philosophy student, because a lot of these videos I see are oriented towards readers of fiction. Annotations are about expressing things visually on the page, but it's just places where there is interesting stuff going on. It's not necessarily aimed towards the kind of way that I go about reading philosophical texts. So I'm going to be talking about 5 different works that I've annotated and talking about how my style has progressed in a sense, but also just changes depending on the work that I'm going to be annotating and how this might prove useful, because some might think that annotating a text is just messing it up and making it more confusing. But I think that it not only personalizes your text, but it also enhances your reading, if only at the cost of making your reading go slower. Now, I want to start first with the materials that I use. For my pen, I really like to use the Papermate Inkjoy. This is a nice pen because it doesn't really bleed, but the writing is strong enough where it's not like those little Bic ballpoint pens that kind of have a hard time writing. And when I'm doing like more substantial writing, I prefer to use fountain pens because I like the way those write the most, but you can't use a fountain pen in most books because it'll bleed through like crazy. So this pen is a nice balance because it lasts a fairly long time, it's robust, the construction is nice in my hands, and I use this the most. This is what I do most of my notes in the books with, and underlining things will be with this. Then the next thing I like to use is highlighters. I prefer the Sharpie highlighters just because those are the nice ones, and I like these small ones just because they're easy to carry with you and use. I also really like these cool highlighters that Sharpie has where you can see through the tip, because if you're right-handed and you're going from left to right, sometimes you can't see the end of the text. Sometimes you end up highlighting past it, and this allows you to see through the text, which is pretty cool. But I also like to use these Papermate Flare pens. They're really tiny and skinny, and these allow for more writing with different colors because it's hard to write in different colors with highlighters. And I also find that especially the yellow highlighters tend to fade after a while, as you can see in some of my Hegel annotations, and as such I like these more because not only can I underline and circle in different colors, but I can notate notes in different colors to change the importance level of my note taking. In terms of like little paper stuff, I love to use flags, whether they're paper flags, which you can actually write on, or whether they're plastic sticky flags, where part of it is clear and part of it is not something you can write on, but is colored. And you can see I use those all over my books. And they're really useful because they provide little benchmarks for what's going on in your text and how things can change in their importance. So I usually have some kind of system, which varies from book to book, about how important something is. Usually I'll have a color for just kind of cool quotable things that are relatively important. I'll have another color up for kind of big ideas, and then I'll have other ones for book-wide ideas that are extremely important that if I'm referencing the book, I'm going to need. And I might even have a 4th level sometimes if I need to be ultra specific. And this highlights an important part about my note-taking strategies, which is that I am notating in order to go back to the book later. As a philosopher, it's important that all the books we read are able to be referred back to, and that the knowledge is not something where we're just reading the book once and never coming back to it, but it's the case where note-taking can help take a 500 or 600 page book, like for example the Phenomenology of Spirit, and break it down into chunks where you've been through it, and you can make it easier for yourself when you have to go back and quote things or just kind of reread certain sections that didn't make sense, and you can see not only your thought process on the page, but you can reference back to things that you either need to quote or, again, just reread. Now, I also like sticky notes in a variety of sizes. I have these cool kind of longer ones, which are cool, and then I also have like the normal kind of yellowy sticky notes or whatever. I've also got these weird doctor ones, which I never really use those, but they're here. And these allow me to say longer things that I wouldn't normally be able to say. But the problem is when you look at a lot of people annotating their books, they put the sticky note right in the middle of the page. And it just covers up the entire work, which with a lot of philosophy books doesn't really work because words are not dispensable in philosophy texts. It's usually the case that if you want to understand what's going on with what you're talking about on the sticky note, you need to know what happened under the sticky note. And of course, you want to place these things here where you're not going to have to be removing them, which presents a challenge with how are you going to actually put your sticky notes in. And we'll see how later in my copy of Being in Time, I ameliorated that issue and was able to use sticky notes to write longer ideas that would also serve as bookmarkers like the flags, but would also not obscure the text, which is important for me. So now getting into some examples. First, I have my copy of Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. This is one of the Britannica series books. This is number 12, and the Meditations are in the back. And when we open up to the Meditations, we can see that there's only one color ever used, and it's just my pen. It happens to be my fountain pen, and you can see it bleeds through a significant amount. But in this situation, I was reading this book just kind of taking notes on it. I didn't really find that I needed levels of importance because, frankly, I didn't find this text to be very tiered in terms of important ideas. So you can see I've got certain notes throughout here, either arrows pointing to things and kind of briefly explaining my thoughts on it or what it might mean, or I've got stars next to important things. And in this way, I just star something that's super important and I'll put a flag on that page. That way I can better understand it. And sometimes in the margins or in the text itself, I'll talk about if something is being super relativistic or if it's used by later philosophers in such and such a way. And I'll also write on the flags what exactly the thing that I've flagged is talking about. That way I can just quickly flip to the flag and be like, okay, this is talking about death, or this is talking about such and such. And my flag system is in 2 tiers. I've got the blue, which is important, and orange is very important. And I have big stars next to that so I can figure it out. But you can see throughout that I'm also very much talking with the text. And this is something really important that I go on to do in my next book on this list. For my copy of Rene Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy, this is a really important book that I felt very connected with. And as I go through it, we can see that there are a lot of conversations back and forth between Descartes and I, which I think is an interesting part of reading philosophy books and annotating them. It's often difficult to find other philosophers that you can talk with in real time. And when you're annotating a book, you can basically do that. So sometimes I underline things and I virtually maintain the same color throughout. I'm just using the pen. Sometimes I might write on the side exactly what this is in summary, and you can see I just am using a highlighter for the most important spots, like this one toward the end of Meditation 1. And this helps to keep it relatively clear, and this is the benefit of not changing stuff around too much, is that when you highlight something, it sticks out a lot more. and I only have 3 flags on this entire book, which are tiered. I've got the yellow for the lowest kind, the orange for the second lowest, and the red slash kind of orangey, pinky red for the super important stuff. And this is generally stuff that I'm either going to be quoting or something like that. And you can see as we get into the later meditations, I start to talk a lot more with Descartes, talking about where I might think he's wrong or explaining my thought process. And this is really important because I'll just fill up the margins with me talking about things, which allows me to read the book a lot better the second time because I can either see where my thought process was and where it was wrong, or where my thought process was and where it was correct. And for me, it allows my reading experience as I'm going through the book to be more beneficial because I am allowed to process things by writing them down physically. There's kind of a thing in school where they tell you, oh, you should write down something you want to study because it helps implant it into your brain. And I think in the same vein, when you're taking notes and you read through something that's really important, summarize it on the side in the margin, and it'll help you have a more enjoyable experience because especially if you get lost like you will in a lot of higher level texts, you can go back a paragraph or two and see what you said and reconvene, and you can write important definitions to the side or just underline single important words and things like that. And you can both talk to the text and have it be useful for your reference. Now, for my copy of Nietzsche's Human All Too Human, I took a very different approach. The flagging system is much more thorough and maintains itself across the duration of the text. I've got the yellow for just kind of cool quotes and things like that, which I highlight. And you can see in this text, I basically just use the highlighter unless I'm writing a note to the side, in which case I may use my pen. But I'm basically just using a yellow highlighter, and I've got yellow flags for important things, orange for decently important, pink for pretty important, green for extremely important, and I've got this one blue flag, which is for the very last aphorism, which just really spoke to me and really was a great way to finish off the book. And we can see throughout this text, because it's set up in an aphoristic style, I can't really annotate it the same way as other texts. It's much easier if something is important, instead of highlighting the whole thing, I'll just highlight the number of the aphorism. And it makes it a lot easier for me to just look through and see, okay, here's a cool thought that I should probably go back on and look. And other than the occasional star, or exclamation mark, or interesting things like that, I'm basically just highlighting the text where I think it's important. And this can be pretty nice, especially for a book like this that isn't necessarily rigorous compared to something like the Phenomenology of Spirit or Being in Time or the Science of Logic or something like this. It's a lot easier to just go through it and find quotable moments like that and flag them when they're important. Now next we're starting to get on to some more especially difficult texts where I found note-taking and annotating to be extremely important, and that's in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. You can see that my annotation of this book is quite extensive. I think an important thing that you should do when you get to these bigger texts is, for example, I've got this sticky note off to the side, and this separates different sections of the book. The latter 100 pages or so is simply an analysis of the text, basically summarizing each paragraph. And in order for me to have a goal in mind of, okay, I just need to get to this sticky note in order to be done, makes it a little bit more clear where the book actually ends. And if I do need to reference this analysis, I can quickly flip to this sticky note and go back to it. And that way I have the book clearly segmented off to make it have more utility for me. When it gets on to the note-taking strategy here, I actually have a threefold structure of how I'm actually annotating things. I've just got my underlining with pen, which is relatively important things. I've got highlighting with a highlighter, which is very important things. And I've got a blue Papermate pen kind of thing that I've used sometimes, which is for extremely important book-wide things that, especially if I was going to reference back to this, I would need to know these, not necessarily because they're quotable, although they can be, but because these are the important topics. So this blue has a very specific purpose, which is stuff that I would need to read again if I wanted to understand exactly what the phenomenology is saying. And if I wanted to quote something, I might go to the spots where I've highlighted. And the flag structure is similar. I've got yellow for relatively important things, orange is next, then red/pink, and I go up. But you can see I've got two different kinds of flags in here. Part of the reason for that is because I ran out of these clear colored flags and I had to go to these paper flags. And these are nice because you can actually write on the flag what is going on in what you've referenced here with the flag. That way you can easily go from flag to flag if you're looking for something specific and be like, okay, this is talking about the contentless existence of the laws of logic, or this is talking about death, or all sorts of other things. And like this paragraph 346 was one that I thought was just super cool. And you can see I've used stars and I've used that blue highlighter, or that blue pen, I guess, to make this really important. And I have the green flag, which is stuff that's super important, and blue is extra important. And especially in this first blue flag, I have basically underlined what the dialectical process is. And you can see my feeling of revelation just by looking at the page, and my thought process of finally having it all make sense. And throughout, these blue flags show, for example, the second blue flag is talking about the idea of freedom according to Hegel, and I've got a box around it. So there's a lot more variation here, and you start to realize, especially when something becomes super profound for you, your note-taking strategies kind of go out the window, and you just do what makes you happy on that particular page, which is how it should work. So I've got a lot of variation of commenting on what Hegel is saying on the side, or summarizing what he's saying, or arguing with him, or highlighting specific words that are important. And in general, I have found this to be indispensable. Even if I didn't have the flags on the phenomenology, I would have no way to navigate it as a reader that is coming back in hindsight. And having it like this makes it not only enjoyable for me, knowing that this is my version of the phenomenology of spirit, but also that I've made it easier for me to understand going back, especially when I did a fairly large 20 to 30 page paper on this and needed to reference back to a lot of Hegel's thought. And it made it a lot easier to quote and to go back and do some reference reading on exactly what he was talking about. Now, finally, I've got my copy of Being in Time, which I'm still reading. I'm still on my way through Division 2 of Being in Time, but my strategy changed a lot. You can see on the actual side of the book that I'm basically only using these paper flags, and they end up congealing in the very top or bottom of the page because, as you can see, you can't put them in the middle of the page or else they would cover up the text. And I remedied this problem later with these green flags, for example, where I simply took paper flags and I cut them short. So they're just smaller flags and I can put them in the middle. And this just makes it easier because when you have all these flags right next to each other, it's harder to differentiate between them or get between them. And I just think it makes the book a little weird. I like kind of having the flags put around everywhere. You can also see I've experimented with these cut sticky notes, which I can use to put important qualifiers for what is being referenced on the side of the book, so I can simply see it and see that, oh, this is talking about death as possibility orientation or something like that. And this makes it a lot more clear what exactly I'm referencing. Now, for my copy of Being in Time, I actually went through 3 different note-taking processes because I came back to this book at 3 different times. We can see in the beginning, I'm basically just using a pen and a yellow highlighter. and I'm doing very detailed either synopses of, for example, ontology levels here on page 38. I have kind of the two different levels of ontology, which may not necessarily be a topic in Heideggerian scholarship, but it was something that I felt he was trying to say, and I differentiated that so that I could go back and see what are these different levels of ontology. And you can see I've basically just underlined important stuff and highlighted especially important things, and I'm doing a lot of writing on the side of what exactly is going on, and occasionally just flagging things that I find to be critically important. And especially on, for example, here on page 97, you can see that I've highlighted a lot of just individual terms, such as Zughaftigkeit is a very long German word that they've translated as equipmentality here. And of course, you can see I've circled das Zug at the bottom to kind of talk about Heidegger's idea of a tool, which is a really important thing. I did a video on tool being below in das Zug. And you can see that at least for this text, it merited a lot more just individual underlining of terms. As we go on, as we get here around page like 140, we can see that I'm starting to use this pink highlighter, this yellow highlighter, and the underlining with my pen. And this just added another tier to my note-taking, which I found to be helpful because it's hard in these big, dense books because everything is important and everything is relevant to the discussion, but the stuff that you use with that highest tier of importance is the stuff that you actually need to reference the most often. Whereas the stuff that you're underlining and highlighting may just only be relevant within that chapter to understand what the pink stuff is saying. And as such, I just layered and tiered my note-taking more. And especially here on page 156, you can see I'm using a variety of, from sentence to sentence, I'm changing the highlighting to accentuate certain things. And sometimes this is to add emphasis where I feel the author is using emphasis, such as the other is encountered in its Dasein within the world. I thought that this was not only important, but something that he was trying to emphasize, and maybe he didn't put italics or bold or underline it here or anything, but I thought that it needed more clear annotation to make that clearer to me as a reader. Now, as we go on towards, around page 280, I'm now using a completely different system. In the beginning of this chapter here of Division 2, Chapter 1, you can see I've got this orange underlining pen, this purple underlining pen, and then my just normal ink pen. And this I found to be helpful because, again, I'm trying to get away from highlighters because they might fade. I'm not sure if there was something particular, especially in my Phenomenology of Spirit. The yellow seems to have faded, but not really in my copy of Being in Time. But you can see here, I've basically used the same system. I've got my pen for important things, orange for really important, and purple for extra important. And I'm basically doing the same thing I normally would, and especially here on like page 282, you can see some more variety in the ways that I'm taking my notes in terms of what's being underlined and what's being starred. And the star is helpful because when you have so much important stuff on one page, you again need to add a level of importance with all sorts of things like that. And an important thing about these hard texts, for example, on page 284, you can see I've done some significant writing in the margins in terms of explaining either what he's saying or making a rebuttal or something. And sometimes these thoughts can be really long. So you'll find, especially as the text ebbs and flows, so too will your note-taking strategies. And here on page 294, you can see this process again, ebbing and flowing from sentence to sentence. I'm changing the importance to make it more clear to me that, okay, these are the most important sentences, and you've got some important ones in between, but, if I want to learn about death and I want to go to this page, I have a lot more clearly in front of me how exactly I'm to be finding that. So I hope this has been helpful. I've got lots of different strategies and things that I go through, and I think an important thing to realize is that note-taking strategies change from person to person and depending on the text. You should alter your strategy depending on the amount of work you want to put into the text, such as we saw with the Meditations, where it's very simple and it's not really something I'm planning on referencing a ton because it's not relevant to my area of study particularly much, but I still do want to have some variety in the ways I'm note-taking, all the way up to something like Being in Time, where I'm being very explicit in the difference from sentence to sentence, partially because I feel that the text changes from sentence to sentence in terms of importance, so much so that the note-taking not only makes it better for me having a reading experience, but going back and referencing it, and visually in terms of the book, and all this other stuff. So I hope this has been helpful and given you some thoughts, and I really think this might make reading a little bit more enjoyable for you, because reading is not something that I am particularly happy of doing. I just like having read, as Alex O'Connor would say, and I think that note-taking might make the little reading experience a little bit more fun because you can see you've put work into the books. It's not just a book that you have to make your way through, getting from page to page. It's something that you engage in every single page and write down your thoughts in order to have a conversation with yourself and have a conversation with what the text is actually trying to say.